I dive into this, any questions about any things? I'll take up to 2 of them, because we know I start to get annoyed after that. But I don't like being questioned. All right. Good. Interrogated, yes. Okay, well, today we're going to continue talking about the Gilded Age, and we're going to start by talking about one of its more colorful characters, a guy named J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, this is him as a young man. When you see him as an old man, you're going to go, wait, is that the same guy? But this is young J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan is kind of a good, embodiment of the Gilded Age. Like, he is the Gilded Age personified almost. In the sense that as a young man, he was sent to, he actually grew up, he differs from some of the Gilded Age leaders in that he grew up wealthy, and so his father was a banker, had a fair amount of money, sent him to Switzerland to study and to learn, and then his father also paid, as was something that you could do, his father paid for somebody else to go and fight in JP's place during the Civil War, right? So this was a thing you could do. You pay X amount of money, and then somebody else basically goes and fights in the war for you, which seems really reputable. Anyway, JP did not, however, totally sit out the war. He actually made quite a bit of money off of it. It was one of his first business ventures was getting involved in the Civil War. He would buy, for instance, a set of really old muskets, right, that he could find for cheap. And then he would hire somebody else to go and rifle the barrels, straighten it out, that sort of thing, so he could actually shoot. And then he takes these old, and I'm talking like decades-old weapons, sells them to the Union Army, makes a tidy profit, right? Now, on the other hand, probably that guy who was hired to take his place now has a crappy gun that's going to blow up in his face, but he made a lot of money. And so that was J.P. Morgan. And as I mentioned last time, all the period that we talked about leading up to the Civil War, for most of that part of early America, it was the Jeffersonian, Democratic, Republican view that ruled, that was the predominant political view. With the Civil War and after, the Republicans and as sort of the next generation of the Hamiltonian Adams view take over. And a lot of that has to do with the Civil War itself. So today we're going to start out by talking about the Civil War and how it ties into the Gilded Age. So what J.P. Morgan did was what we might call profiteering, right? He had a whole intelligence network of people who could tell him, this feels really loud, right there. Whole network of people who could tell him, what the Union Army was looking for, what sort of things would they be buying next, right? A lot of people that he basically bribed or whatever in order to understand what he could make the most money off of at any given time during the war. And the profiteering was so rampant during the Civil War that the federal government didn't know how to stop it, right? There were so many people, right, selling bad shoes to the army, right? And then you wind up with a bunch of soldiers going into battle with shoes that are falling apart on them, right? Not very helpful. Bad weapons, all kinds of bad supplies, food that's already gone bad, right? Or things where they've just dramatically inflated the prices. So there were all these people making money, profiteering off of the war, and it was annoying enough for the federal government to finally do something about it. And what they did was actually one of the most innovative things that we've ever done in the federal government. And I study innovation in government. I can tell you that what we did during the Civil War is probably about as innovative as the federal government has ever been, and then it's kind of been downhill from there. But anyway, they invented this thing called Kitan, which is basically a system whereby if you were able to find out that somebody was profiteering, then the amount of money that the government saved as a result of that bad deal not occurring, you got a big chunk of that, right? So it was kind of like a bounty. And so it turned a lot of people into bounty hunters against profiteers, which helped to dramatically curtail the amount of theft that was going on. And so this I always use this example because it's an interesting solution, but it's also indicative of the fact that the powers of the federal government expand dramatically, right? We could go through all kinds of things about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln did a number of things which were, in the normal course of events, we would call illegal and unconstitutional. He did them under the assumption that in the extraordinary case of the Civil War, the president had, as the commander-in-chief, had extraordinary military powers. So he could go and, for instance, arrest state legislators in some of the border states in order to keep them from leaving the Union, right? He could go and seize properties. He could circumvent a lot of things that are pretty fundamental, like Bill of Rights type rights. And the idea was kind of like George Washington and the whole Cincinnatus thing. Lincoln was effectively dictator, right, for that period because of this extraordinary crisis. And the idea being that he would then set down that power. Of course, Lincoln, unfortunately, is shot, right, and is shortly after we win the war. And that sets in motion a whole set of things that were not well anticipated. Before I get into that, I want to show this diagram, which I find fascinating, as sort of a depiction of the changing idea of union and the nature of the government during this time period. And it's actually a really huge picture, so let me just pull it up so we can kind of zoom in on it a little bit. This is kind of in the top left corner, you see Union soldiers fighting, right? So this was created, I believe this was printed in 1862, so it's in the middle of the Civil War. You see Union soldiers fighting, but you also see, this sort of cloud burst indicating almost that, it's divinely inspired that they're going to win eventually. Then you have, as you pan over on this thing, this whole structure, and it goes and lays out the Constitution of the United States as the supreme law of the land, as we've already talked about. It sets the Supreme Court over here off to the side, somewhere over there, and then the presidency and the executive branch right here, the legislature below them, right? I'm not sure how Congress felt about that, but it places the legislature below the presidency. And then it's got all these crazy lines, right, that represent constitutional authority and executive authority. The red lines are the executive, the blue are the constitutional authority. And you see them going down and reaching down to, look, all the states are here below all of those things. And there's, and you've got all these pieces. It shows a group of founding fathers over here, and these guys are kind of, more or less, this is sort of the Federalist camp, right? Hamilton and those guys, Adams, they include George Washington, but this is a group that they generally are highlighting as the important founding fathers, which we would point to as that sort of Hamiltonian branch of the founding fathers, right? Anyway, and then it shows the different powers of the executive authority, but it's just interesting to see this whole piece right here. And if we zoom in a little bit more, let's see if we can do this without making it blurry. I've actually got it in the PowerPoint, so let's just do it from there. Okay, so most of you will not be able to read this. I'll just read it to you. But this is what it says down in the corner. The blue line connecting the states shows the democratic idea of union. The upper part of the diagram, the federal idea, contended for by Washington, John Adams, Hancock, Hamilton, and others. The present crisis shows the wisdom of the old federals of having a strong government. It is the duty of every citizen to obey the federal government first and at all times. The large blue line running from the states to the Constitution represents allegiance, as all officers must swear to support the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of his own state before he can enter upon the duties of office. The red line flowing out represents constitutional power. So what we see here is a fundamental shift, right? Away from the idea of the United States as a collection of countries, right, that are just sort of bound together to the federal law is supreme, right? The national government is supreme, and that everybody needs to obey that law first, that national level law first and above that of the states. This is a dramatic shift, right, in our concept of how government works and what it means. And so this sets in motion the direction of the United States to this day, right? Like, we don't ever stop to think about whether or not the state of Utah or the national government is supreme, right? And there's no question left anymore at this point. The national government has more authority. Anything it does trumps what the state does, except for in extremely rare circumstances, right? So this sets the course for the way in which power changes and the nature of power changes in the United States. Okay, so how does this play out? Well, Lincoln, as I point out, is assassinated. But even before he's assassinated, he begins this program called Reconstruction. Reconstruction is, hey, we've got to rebuild the South and bring it back into the Union. And certainly by the end of the war, places like, this is Richmond, which had been the capital, as you can see, I mean, if we looked at this before the Civil War, you would see a bunch of buildings in the background instead of just chimneys and ruins, right? I mean, this could be ancient Rome, right? I mean, the war just utterly devastated the city, and so structurally, everything's torn down, broken to pieces, blasted apart, and so you've got to physically rebuild it, but you have to rebuild it in other ways as well. And the idea that Lincoln had was that he wanted to bring the South in as gently as he could. He did not think it was right to punish the South, right? He did not believe that states had done something wrong. He believed that a few people had done things wrong, right? The leaders had made mistakes. And so his idea was, he had a very gentle idea of Reconstruction. There was Lincoln's 10% plan. So if 10%, the equivalent of 10% of the voting eligible population within a state as of the 1860 election declared allegiance to the Union, then they would be accepted. That state would be accepted back into the Union. No punishment, you don't have to worry about anything. You're just let back in. This was Lincoln's concept, right? And if you remember back to his second inaugural address that I talked about, where he's talking about fighting this war with malice toward none, right, with charity for all, that's very consistent, right, with his idea about what they were doing. He didn't see it as his job to go and punish the South for what they were done. It was his job to bring the Union back together. So we see, this is called the rail splitter at work repairing the Union, and it's Lincoln and his vice president, I'm about to talk about, kind of working on rebuilding the country. Lincoln, unfortunately, is shot in 1865, right after the war, and dies, and we're left with Andrew Johnson as president. Now, this is where it gets weird, because Andrew Johnson is a Southerner and a Democrat, right? So the president now is a Southern Democrat, and And Johnson was very much in favor of Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction. His idea was to bring the South in gently, to not put a lot of restrictions or impose a lot of punishment on people. But he was also opposed to a lot of key pieces that the Republican-controlled legislature wanted to do, right? And there's this group called the Radical Republicans, who I'm going to talk more about. But these Radical Republicans were the ones who thought that basically the South needed to be punished, right? It needed to be punished, broken down, and rebuilt in the form of a new, like a totally rebuilt country. And so those were the Radical Republicans. One of the things that happens as part of Reconstruction on sort of the social level is now you have all of these former slaves, freed blacks, and a lot of programs were started. So here, this is an example of a group of women who came from the North and taught black women, recently freed, how to sew, how to teaching them basic reading, right? Teaching a series of skills and things. And there were a lot of groups like this. Teachers would come down from the North. People with various skills would come to try and help those who had been freed be able to sustain themselves through their own abilities. The formal structure of this was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau had just kind of like a catch-all job, right? So if you were a recently freed slave, you would come in and you would talk with these guys, and they would help you in terms of maybe finding loved ones that you've been separated from, finding work, finding a place to live, ways to develop job skills, all those sorts of things. And this program was really hated, as you might imagine, by Southerners, by Southern whites, I should say, because it was helping out black Southerners, but not helping out white Southerners, and they just really hated the concept. So this is a famous depiction of a Union soldier, commander at a Freedmen's Bureau, holding back sort of an angry mob ready to pick a fight. There were a lot of consequences of Reconstruction. One of them is this idea of a carpetbagger. So if you've ever heard the term carpetbagger, today we use it to refer to somebody who kind of shows up out of nowhere, and usually in politics it's what we call a parachute politician, right? Like I move in, I'm like, hey everybody, I'm ready to be your congressman. Thanks. Give me your vote. And that's kind of true to what they were in a certain extent. Carpetbaggers were like one part public service and one part greed, okay? And some of them were all of this category, and some of them were all of this category, right? But if you think of them as having both motivations at play, that's important to understand. So these were Northerners who had come down, and some of them bought up cheap land that was now available because it had been seized or whatever from Southern plantation owners. Some of them came down specifically to hold some sort of political office, whether appointed or elected. And all of this was made possible in part because of the nature of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, part of what Reconstruction did, along with the key amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which we'll talk about more next time, which basically gives citizenship rights, voting rights to all Americans, including former slaves. Those amendments, they were things that came out of Reconstruction, and yet these radical Republicans saw that blacks were still being stopped from fully participating both in the economy and in the political structure. And so they created what was basically a military reconstruction, right? A military occupation in the South, where they divided the South into 5 military districts that were actually controlled by the military, and laws were enforced them. So Adelbert Ames here, this guy's a good example. He was sent down to be the military governor of the state of Mississippi. He's from Maine. He was a Union soldier, and he's basically given the job of being the military governor, the occupying, military leader of Mississippi, in order to see that the rights of black citizens in Mississippi were protected, try and increase their ability to vote, their involvement in the economy, their access to opportunity, all that sort of thing. He's one of the ones that we hold up as a good example because he seems to have been very serious about what he was trying to do. He was the military governor, and then he was elected as the Republican governor of the state of Mississippi. But unfortunately, despite all of his efforts, all of his work, he was not able to accomplish most of his goals, in part because of the various vigilante groups that emerged in the South during this time, including the Ku Klux Klan. Hopefully you've all heard of them. The Red Shirts, and various other groups who, often would, in order to protect their anonymity, they wore some sort of mask, right? We think of KKK members now generally as wearing all white sort of sheets, but back then it was more, I'll put a pillowcase over my head and wear a goofy uniform thing and go beat up people. And so these guys, despite the presence of this sort of military occupation to try and reinvent things, provided enough violence, enough intimidation, enough fear that Reconstruction was largely unsuccessful. There were also black codes, right? So these states continued to create and increasingly created what we would call black codes. These were different laws at a state level designed to try and keep black citizens from voting, from being able to participate fully in the political process. And they formed, in a sense, a new form of slavery. The vagrancy laws in particular basically made it illegal to be black, right, in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you happen to be wandering a street, you could be arrested for being a vagrant. Then you get put on a chain gang and you're put to work on various projects. You're kind of right back in slavery, right? So these sorts of laws that were passed made it very difficult. And these were things that truly infuriated the radical Republicans. The most famous leader is this guy, Thaddeus Stevens. I knew this was going to be one of those weird slides where the name came in. Let's try it one more time. Sometimes the sound effect was there. I knew I got this from that other guy's slides. All right. So, Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens was a very prominent member of Congress, leader of the radical Republicans. He led a lot of these efforts, believed that the South should be treated as an occupied, conquered nation and truly reconstructed, rebuilt down to sort of its DNA. He believed that they should take everybody in the South, every white plantation owner who owned 200 acres or more, and seize their property, and then divide that up into 40-acre lots that would be given to former slaves. And that turns out to be something like 70,000 individuals in the South that they would be stealing or seizing their property. And Stevens he had a lot of these radical ideas, but he was the one who really pushed for Reconstruction. And depending on who you are are, where you're from, your perspective on what government should and should not do, these guys are either maybe villains or heroes, right? And I think the truth is that they're probably somewhat both, right, depending on who you're talking about in the particular situation. Lincoln obviously had a very different idea. He wanted to see a lot of these same things done. He just wanted to see them done in a much gentler way than the radical Republicans. And one argument goes that the forcefulness with which the radical Republicans pursued Reconstruction is part of what helped to bring about these vigilante groups like the KKK as a sort of reaction to how fervent they were. But a lot of good things came out of Reconstruction, right? Schools. There were a lot of public schools that were built in the South. Public education, not really a thing in the South, big thing in New England, right? So now we have schools. We have schools that are built for free blacks, hospitals, universities, right? All of these sorts of things are created in large numbers as a result of Reconstruction. And education is generally seen as the greatest contribution of Reconstruction to free blacks in the South. Okay. So, yeah, let's just ask this question. Do you agree or do you disagree with the approach of the radical Republicans, right? I mean, does the way that they did things make sense? Does it make sense to go and occupy the South as a military force, or should they have tried some other approach? What do you think? I'm looking for responses. People raising hands and things like right there.
So we go occupying the South because they didn't have these structures because I know they only want to make it stimulate. If this is still not these structures, with that, I mean, how fair would that be? On this side, being treated as a different nation, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So in some instances they did operate with a suspension of habeas corpus because under the Stevens argument, under the Thaddeus Stevens argument, they were no longer covered by the Constitution, right? So in Stevens' view, because they had rebelled, they no longer held any of the protections of the Constitution, right? Which was why he had this idea of going and seizing all of this property and so forth. Now, the application of that varied by who happened to be in charge and where you were at. But yeah, you did see that sort of suspension of things as fundamental as habeas corpus. Does that help?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, because General Sherman and all those guys of what they did is that should they be persecuted for, like, I don't know, I guess, now we call it war crime, or you can say civilians and just taking people's property without due process, stuff like that.
Yeah, so was General Sherman a war criminal, right? I mean, no, that's a good question, right? Was he a war criminal? And we'll kind of return to this question. I think, like, bookmark this in your mind, because when we get to the end of World War II, we're going to ask this question again, right, about what defines a war criminal. But it's really mostly a question of who defines a war criminal, right? And overwhelmingly, the case is that the side that wins defines who is a war criminal and who isn't, right? I mean, if you win, then you generally don't punish your own people, right? But if the other guys lost, then many Confederate leaders were treated as war criminals, right? Their property was seized. Some of them were imprisoned and various things because they were on the losing side, right? Things of that nature. Okay. Yes.
Well, I'm thinking about it. I tend to agree with both sides. I don't feel like strong punishment is necessary. I like the idea of being gentle, not a lot of punishment, not a lot of persecution, but still a firm, still a way to grab them and say, this is how it's going to be. This is, you won the war.
Yeah.
We beat you, and now you're going to follow the rules.
Yeah. So you hedged like a politician and just, you're like right sitting on the fence. No, I'm just messing with you. Okay. All right. Anybody want to take a strong stand on one side? Yes.
I haven't found out yet how I think the South should be completed.
Yeah.
I do believe that the Constitution does not become null and void just because the South lost. And so the Constitution is written for these are the principles in which we are supposed to run our country.
Yeah.
And so the right to property, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution should still be obeyed, but also in some way, and I haven't figured out how.
Yeah.
It's not needed to change.
Right.
They got into slavery, deeper into slavery because of greed.
Yeah.
And that needed to change.
Yeah. Yeah, so hindsight's 2020, right? I mean, we can clearly say, we can go and point out all the problems with Reconstruction. And what you're talking about is certainly in keeping with Lincoln's view, right? Like Lincoln's view, he did not see them as separated in any way from their constitutional rights once they were part of the Union again. That is, Stevens, when I forget when is this at? Anyway, he leads the impeachment of the President of the United States because the President kept trying to veto various radical portions of Reconstruction. He was not removed from office, but he was impeached. So there's like the House has a role and then the Senate has a role. And this was towards the end of Stevens' life. But Stevens really did believe that they had forfeited their constitutional rights. So like he had this argument in mind. And so one of the great questions about history is what would have happened if Lincoln had not been shot, right, in Ford's Theater? Like how would he have done things differently? And I would love to know, probably more than any other historical question, I would love to know what Lincoln would have done, because he certainly was dedicated to this idea of approaching things in a much more gentle way, and he had a great deal of popular support, far more popular than Johnson was. And so what would have happened? We just don't know, right? And so it's one of these questions. But whatever the case, what we see in part is that this is from 1876. And so this is a little hard to read, but these darker spots show the percentage of the vote that went to Rutherford B. Hayes, who's the Republican. And so the dark blue is pretty low, right? That's like 0% to 10%, I think. And then these lighter blue areas up to 28, right? And then it's not until we get up into like the yellows that we're getting to 50% or better. So you can see that in the north, right, where the Republican stronghold is, Rutherford B. Hayes obviously does well. But the effort at Reconstruction didn't really have the effect that they had hoped for, right? So in theory, black voters should be voting. They should be able to vote in the South, and that would lead to some Republican votes, right? I mean, just common sense would say that a majority of black voters at this time would vote for the Republican candidate. And we can see places, right, where they where it is Republican, a few hot spots where, in Virginia, Reconstruction seems to have had more success than other